Neil Carver had never been the type to seek out conflict. At 45, he had spent the better part of his life restoring old furniture, appreciating the patience and precision required to breathe new life into forgotten things. He worked with his hands, preferred quiet spaces, and had a deep respect for history not just in objects, but in the places that held them. When he purchased his new home, a century-old estate with its original woodwork still intact, it felt like finding a relic that had been waiting just for him. It wasn't grand or particularly large, but it had character. Stained glass windows that cast intricate patterns of light onto the hardwood floors, a front porch that creaked underfoot like a whisper of the past, and a sprawling backyard with an ancient oak that stood like a silent guardian over the property. It was the kind of house that needed care, not just repairs but attention to detail, someone who understood its worth beyond market value. And Neil was ready to give it just that. He wasn't a recluse by any means, but he valued his solitude. He had no interest in making small talk with neighbors beyond a polite nod when collecting his mail or a simple greeting if he passed them while walking to his truck. It wasn't that he disliked people, he just never felt the need to insert himself into their lives or allow them into his. That was why he was only mildly aware of the woman who lived across the street when he moved in. He had seen her watching him from her porch the day he arrived, arms crossed, expression unreadable, as he unloaded the first boxes from his truck. He chalked it up to curiosity. People in small, tight-knit neighborhoods always seemed wary of newcomers, as if an unfamiliar face somehow disrupted the delicate balance of their carefully maintained routines. But it wasn't until the following morning that Neil realized her curiosity was more than passing. She appeared at the edge of his driveway as he was hauling a heavy oak coffee table from the back of his truck, waiting just long enough for him to notice her before she spoke. "You're the new owner," she said, not phrasing it as a question. Neil set the table down carefully, taking a moment to wipe his hands on his jeans before turning toward her. Up close, she was in her late 50s, maybe early 60s, with precisely styled blonde hair and an expression that was both expectant and scrutinizing. She had the look of someone accustomed to being listened to, the kind of woman who made decisions for other people and expected compliance without question. "That's right," Neil said evenly. She smiled, though there was something measured about it, something that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Karen Wilson," she introduced herself, extending a perfectly manicured hand. "I'm on the neighborhood council." Neil hesitated before shaking her hand, already feeling the weight of where this conversation might be headed. "Neil," he replied simply, offering nothing more. Karen's gaze flicked past him toward the house, her lips pursing slightly. "I have to say, it's been a long time since anyone put any real effort into that place. The previous owner, well, let's just say they didn't have much of a sense of responsibility when it came to maintaining the historical integrity of the neighborhood." Neil raised an eyebrow. "Seems like a solid house to me." She made a soft, dismissive noise, tilting her head. "Oh, sure. Structurally, maybe. But you'll find that things work a little differently around here. We take pride in preserving the character of this community. Some people." She exhaled sharply through her nose, as if discussing something distasteful, don't always follow the guidelines. "I assume you've looked over them?" He hadn't. He didn't have to. He had explicitly confirmed during the purchase that the property was not under the authority of any homeowners association or binding neighborhood agreements. That had been one of the selling points: freedom to restore the home as he saw fit, to work on his own terms without bureaucratic interference. "I did my research," he said simply. Karen's smile tightened. "Well, good. I'm sure you understand the importance of maintaining standards. After all, what's good for the neighborhood is good for property values." Neil had lived in enough places to recognize the underlying message. This wasn't just a friendly neighbor welcoming him to the street. This was a warning thinly veiled beneath the guise of pleasant conversation. A test, even. Would he be compliant? Would he fall in line? He offered a small nod, non-committal, and turned back to his truck. "Nice meeting you," he said over his shoulder, signaling the end of the discussion. Karen lingered for a beat too long before finally stepping back, but as she walked away, Neil could feel her watching him, could sense the unspoken message left hanging in the air. He brushed it off, at least at first. He had no intention of getting involved in whatever local politics were at play here. He had work to do, windows to restore, walls to reinforce, a foundation to check for long-term stability. For the first few days, he kept his focus on the house, settling into a rhythm of early mornings and long hours spent sanding, staining, and repairing. He barely noticed Karen except in brief glimpses, standing at her mailbox a little too long, walking her dog but slowing her pace when passing his house. She never spoke again, not directly, but he could feel her presence looming in the periphery. Then, on the fourth night, Neil woke to a sound he couldn't quite place. A soft scraping noise, like something brushing against the side of the house. He lay still for a moment, listening, trying to determine whether he had imagined it. Then there it was again, closer this time, near the front porch. He moved quietly, slipping out of bed and making his way to the window, careful not to disturb the wooden floors beneath his feet. Peering through the curtains, he expected to see nothing. Maybe a branch shifting in the wind, maybe some nocturnal animal skirting along the edge of the yard. Instead, he saw Karen. She was standing directly in front of his house, one hand pressed against the doorframe, as if testing its sturdiness, the other clutching something small and metallic. The key. His key. For a moment, Neil didn't move, barely breathed. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Had she found it somewhere? Stolen it? Was she actually planning to try and use it? He watched as she lifted her hand slightly, hesitating, then slowly, almost reverently traced her fingers along the grain of the wood. Then, just as silently as she had arrived, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness, as if she had never been there at all. Neil stood frozen, the image burned into his mind. The polite conversation, the lingering presence, the unspoken warnings, it hadn't been about neighborly concern. It had been something else entirely. And whatever it was just beginning. Neil barely slept that night. Even after Karen had disappeared into the darkness, the image of her standing at his front door, touching the frame as if it somehow belonged to her, lingered in his mind like an echo he couldn't shake. He spent the next few hours sitting in his darkened living room, staring toward the front door, waiting to see if she would return. But the night remained still, save for the occasional creak of the old house settling. His thoughts raced in every direction, trying to rationalize what had just happened. Maybe she had found an old key from the previous owner, and in some twisted logic thought it still granted her access. Maybe she had some kind of obsessive need to control the neighborhood, and saw his house as a challenge to her authority. Maybe she was just unstable. None of those explanations sat well with him. The fact remained she had been on his porch, at his door, in the middle of the night. That wasn't the action of someone with good intentions. That was something else entirely. By morning, Neil had made up his mind. This wasn't something he could brush off as a harmless eccentricity. It was a violation, plain and simple. He wasn't the type to immediately escalate things, but he also wasn't the type to sit back and let himself become a target. So, before starting his usual work on the house, he drove into town and found a local locksmith. He didn't just ask for new locks, he had the entire system changed, replacing every single entry point with a fresh set of reinforced deadbolts. He even had a secondary latch installed on the back door, just in case. It was an annoyance, an unexpected expense he shouldn't have had to deal with, but the moment he heard the solid click of the new locks engaging, he felt the first real sense of control since he had moved in. He was careful not to show any signs of unease when he returned home, but he knew Karen was watching. He didn't see her directly, but he could feel it, that same eerie awareness that had been pressing against the edges of his consciousness since the day he arrived. He went about his routine as if nothing had happened, unloading supplies from his truck, sweeping the porch, organizing the tools he had left scattered the day before. If she was looking for a reaction, he wasn't going to give her one. That evening, as he sat on the porch drinking his usual cup of coffee, he finally saw her again. This time she wasn't sneaking around in the dark. She was standing across the street in plain sight, arms folded, watching him with an expression that was impossible to decipher. The way she stood there, completely still, completely composed, sent a slow, crawling sensation down his spine. "Morning, Karen," he said, keeping his voice level. Her lips curled into something that might have been a smile but carried none of the warmth that a real one should. "Busy day?" He sipped his coffee, just getting things in order. Karen nodded slowly, her gaze flicking toward the front door. "I noticed you changed the locks." Neil didn't let his expression shift. He knew what she was doing, poking for a reaction, seeing if she could unsettle him. Figured it was time. You never know how many old copies are floating around. She tilted her head slightly, considering him, then let out a soft chuckle that didn't match the tension in the air. "Good thinking," she said, then, as if the conversation had never happened, turned and walked back toward her house. Neil watched her go, waiting until she was inside before allowing himself a breath. His fingers tightened around his mug. There was something so deliberate about the way she had phrased that "I noticed you changed the locks." Not "I saw," not "I heard," but "I noticed." As if she had been paying attention to something that wasn't her business. A few days passed without incident, and Neil started to convince himself that maybe, just maybe, she had backed off. He kept himself busy with the restoration work, losing himself in the familiar rhythm of sanding, staining, and polishing. It was one of those rare peaceful afternoons when he finally let his guard down that the next escalation happened. It started with a knock at the door. Not a polite one, not the kind of knock that carried even a shred of courtesy. It was loud, insistent, the kind of knock meant to demand attention. Neil wiped his hands on a rag and made his way to the door, already suspecting who it would be. When he opened it, he wasn't wrong. Karen stood there, but this time she wasn't alone. Two men stood behind her, dressed in buttoned shirts and carrying clipboards. City officials, by the look of them. "Afternoon, Mr. Carver," Karen said, her tone as pleasant as ever, but her eyes gleamed with something that sent a cold warning through his veins. "These gentlemen are from the local code enforcement office. We've had some concerns about certain renovations you might be conducting without the proper permits." Neil exhaled slowly, keeping his temper in check. "I haven't made any structural changes, just restorations. I checked the regulations before I started. Everything I've done is well within code." One of the men, a middle-aged guy with thinning hair and an expression of forced neutrality, cleared his throat. "We received an anonymous complaint that there may be unapproved modifications to the property. It's standard procedure for us to conduct an inspection." Neil didn't take the bait. He folded his arms and leaned against the doorframe. "If you have a warrant, I'd be happy to comply." The second official shifted uncomfortably. "It's not that kind of inspection. It's voluntary, but refusal to cooperate can sometimes lead to additional scrutiny." Karen smiled. "I'm sure Mr. Carver has nothing to hide." Neil stared at her, feeling the slow burn of anger tightening in his chest. He knew exactly what this was. She was trying to push him, to force him into compliance, to make him feel powerless. But he wasn't playing her game. "As I said," he repeated, his voice steady, "if you have the legal authority to inspect my property, go ahead and come back with the proper paperwork. Otherwise, I'd appreciate it if you'd respect my rights as a homeowner." The officials exchanged glances before finally nodding, though one of them handed him a business card. "If you change your mind, give us a call." Neil took it without a word, watching as they turned and walked back toward their car. Karen, however, lingered just a moment longer. "You should know," she said softly, so that only he could hear, "this neighborhood has a way of dealing with problems before they get out of hand." Neil didn't blink. "Good thing I'm not a problem, then." For the first time, Karen's mask of polite civility cracked just enough for him to see the contempt underneath. But she said nothing else. She simply turned and followed the inspectors to their car, leaving Neil standing in his doorway with a realization that settled deep into his gut like a stone. She wasn't going to stop. And now she had decided to make things personal. Neil had dealt with difficult people before. He had spent enough time working in restoration to know that some clients were impossible to satisfy, that certain individuals thrived on control, on nitpicking the smallest details to feel a sense of superiority. But Karen was something else. She wasn't just an overbearing neighbor with a tendency to overstep boundaries. She was playing a game, one designed to push him into a corner until he either submitted or left. It was clear now that her goal had never been casual intimidation or harmless nosiness. She wanted something from him, and she had no problem escalating her tactics to get it. After the incident with the inspectors, Neil spent the rest of the evening thinking about his next move. He wasn't a man prone to paranoia, but he also wasn't naive enough to believe this would be the end of it. Karen had tested him, and he had refused to give in. That only meant she would try something else, something worse. He sat at his kitchen table, staring at the card the inspector had left behind, debating whether it was worth calling a lawyer preemptively. A part of him didn't want to overreact after all. Nothing had actually happened yet. But then again, wasn't that the trap? The slow escalation, the pushing of boundaries just enough to be unsettling but not enough to justify an extreme response. It was a game of inches, and Karen was counting on him to ignore the warning signs until she had the upper hand. That night, he double-checked all the locks, set his tools aside in case he needed something within reach, and went to bed later than usual. He told himself he wouldn't let this get to him, that he wouldn't let some controlling woman dictate how he lived in his own home. But at exactly 3:12 a.m., a noise snapped him out of sleep. It was subtle but distinct, a rhythmic scraping sound against wood, like something being dragged slowly across a rough surface. His heart pounded against his ribs as he lay completely still, his ears straining to catch the next sound. Then it came again, a slow, deliberate movement. Not the wind, not an animal, someone was outside. Moving carefully, he slipped out of bed and crept toward the window, keeping his body low as he approached. He pulled back the curtain just an inch, just enough to see outside without making his presence known. His stomach tightened. Karen was standing on his porch. She wasn't knocking, wasn't calling his name, wasn't even pretending to have a reason to be there. She was simply standing there, facing his door, one hand resting lightly against the frame, as if feeling the grain of the wood beneath her fingertips. She wasn't trying to break in, at least, not yet. She was waiting, testing, seeing if he would react. Neil didn't move. His mind worked through the possibilities, running through scenarios as fast as his pulse was hammering in his chest. If he went to the door now, confronted her directly, that was exactly what she wanted. She would act surprised, innocent, feign some excuse. "Oh, I thought I heard something. Oh, I was just worried about you. Oh, I was just checking on the house." And then what? He would have no proof, no way to claim she had done anything wrong, nothing to stop her from coming back again, from pushing further. So he did nothing. He stood there, watching, waiting, letting her think he was asleep. It took several more agonizing minutes, but eventually she stepped away. She didn't leave immediately. She paused at the edge of the porch, her head tilting slightly as if listening, sensing. Then, finally, she walked back across the yard, disappearing into the shadows. Neil exhaled, realizing only then how tightly he had been clenching his jaw. His body was tense, every muscle coiled, but he forced himself to take slow, measured breaths. He couldn't let this shake him. He had dealt with people like her before, people who thrived on control, who needed to establish dominance over others to feel powerful. The worst thing he could do was react on her terms. But he wasn't going to just sit back either. The next morning, before the sun had fully risen, Neil drove into town. He wasn't going to the police, not yet. He knew how this would play out if he walked into the station and told them his neighbor had been on his porch in the middle of the night. They'd ask if she broke in. No, if she threatened him. No, if she damaged property. No, they'd say it was odd, sure, but not illegal. He needed something more. So instead, he made 2 stops. First, he went to a local security company and bought motion-activated floodlights. If she tried sneaking onto his porch again, she would be exposed in an instant. Then, he went to a hardware store and picked up reinforced window locks and an extra deadbolt for the back door. He wasn't taking any chances. By the time he got home and installed everything, he felt a sense of control return. It wasn't just about keeping her out, it was about sending a message. She wanted him to feel helpless, like he had no say in what happened on his own property. He wasn't going to let that happen. But Karen wasn't one to back down easily. That afternoon, while he was working on refinishing the front steps, he heard her voice from across the street. "Oh, Neil," she called, her tone saccharine sweet, too rehearsed to be casual. He turned, keeping his expression neutral as she approached, carrying a basket of what looked like homemade bread. "I realized I never properly welcomed you to the neighborhood." Neil wiped his hands on a rag, glancing at the basket but making no move to take it. "That's thoughtful of you," he said evenly. Karen smiled, but there was something sharp behind it. "I noticed you've been making some changes," she said, her gaze flicking toward the new security lights. "You know, we usually discuss modifications like that in our community meetings." Neil held her gaze, his patience thinning. "Good thing I'm not part of any association, then." Her expression didn't falter, but he saw the momentary flicker of irritation in her eyes. She adjusted the basket in her hands. "I just hope you don't think I was being intrusive the other night," she continued, her voice laced with mock innocence. "I was just making sure everything was all right. This neighborhood has had its fair share of unfortunate incidents." Neil's grip tightened on the rag. "That's so." Karen nodded, leaning in slightly. "We had someone move in a few years back who, well, let's just say they didn't last long. Sometimes people don't realize what it takes to truly belong somewhere." The threat was so thinly veiled it was practically transparent. Neil didn't smile. He didn't blink. He let the silence stretch just long enough to make her uncomfortable. Then finally, he took a step forward, not aggressive, just enough to shift the dynamic. "I appreciate the concern," he said, his voice calm but firm. "But I can take care of myself." Karen held his gaze for another moment, then exhaled sharply, as if finally accepting that she wasn't going to rattle him, at least not yet. She forced a smile and placed the basket on the step beside him. "Well, enjoy the bread," she said lightly, then turned and walked away. Neil didn't touch it. He watched her until she disappeared into her house. Then, without hesitation, he picked up the basket and threw it straight into the trash. He had played this game before, and he knew it was far from over. Neil had spent most of his life avoiding unnecessary conflict, but this was something else entirely. Karen wasn't just an annoying neighbor or a woman with an overblown sense of entitlement. She was something far more dangerous. She had crossed the threshold of being a nuisance and had begun actively inserting herself into his life in ways that made it impossible to ignore. The bread basket had been a message, an unspoken challenge wrapped in the illusion of neighborly kindness, but Neil wasn't stupid enough to fall for it. He had spent years working on intricate restorations, learning to read between the lines of history, uncovering hidden damages that others might overlook. He could see through her performance just as clearly. But the problem wasn't just Karen. It was the fact that no one else seemed to see her for what she really was. The neighbors still greeted her warmly when she walked by, still spoke to her in casual conversation, as if she hadn't spent the last few weeks actively trying to make his life a living hell. To them, she was just another longtime resident, a pillar of the community who had taken it upon herself to keep things in order. And that was the most frustrating part. Neil knew that if things escalated, if she pushed him to the breaking point and he reacted, he would be the one painted as the problem. She had already laid the groundwork with the city inspectors. With her little passive-aggressive comments about security lights in neighborhood meetings. If she wanted to, she could spin this into a completely different narrative, one where he was the aggressor and she was simply a concerned citizen looking out for her community. That realization made his next decision easy. He wasn't going to let her control the story. The first thing he did was call a lawyer, not for any formal action yet, but to start keeping a documented record of everything that had happened. He explained the situation, detailing Karen's escalating behavior, the false inspection claims, the late-night visits, the unspoken threats. The lawyer listened patiently, then gave him simple but crucial advice: document everything. Every interaction, every incident, no matter how small. If she escalates, you want a paper trail. Neil took that advice to heart. He bought a small notebook and started writing down every single detail. When she watched him from across the street, when she made a comment that felt like a veiled threat, when she lingered too long near his property line. It was a tedious, almost obsessive practice, but it gave him a sense of control that he desperately needed. He refused to be caught off guard again. Then, for a few days, things were quiet. Too quiet. Karen didn't approach him, didn't make any passive-aggressive remarks, didn't try to push her way onto his property. She simply went about her daily routine as if none of the past few weeks had happened. If he hadn't known better, he might have thought she had finally given up. But then came the smell. It started subtly, just a faint, unpleasant odor near the side of his house. At first he assumed it was something natural, maybe a dead animal somewhere in the bushes, maybe garbage left too long in the summer heat. But as the hours passed, it got worse, much worse. By nightfall, the stench was unbearable, a thick, rotting scent that clung to the air and made his stomach turn. Neil grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, following the source of the smell. It didn't take long to find it. Someone had dumped raw meat behind his shed. Not just any meat, rotting, maggot-infested chunks of flesh that had clearly been sitting in the sun for days before being placed there. The stench was overwhelming, thick enough to make his eyes water. He covered his nose and mouth with his shirt and took a step back, his mind racing through the implications. This wasn't random. This wasn't an accident. This was a message, and he knew exactly who had sent it. He took out his phone and snapped several photos, documenting every detail before disposing of the rotting meat in a sealed trash bag. Then he went inside, washed his hands until his skin was raw, and sat at his kitchen table, staring at the photos on his phone. This was a new level of escalation. Karen wasn't just watching him anymore, she was actively trying to make his life miserable, pushing boundaries in ways that were harder to prove but impossible to ignore. That night, sleep was out of the question. He sat awake in his living room, listening for any sounds outside, waiting for the next move. But the night passed in silence. She was waiting, watching, testing him. The next morning, Neil took his photos and his notes and went to the police. He didn't expect much. He knew they weren't going to launch a full-scale investigation over some dumped meat, but he wanted an official report on file. If things escalated further, if Karen pushed things into real criminal territory, he wanted proof that he had taken the right steps. The officer at the front desk listened, nodded, and took down the details, but Neil could tell from the man's expression that he wasn't taking it seriously. Just a neighborly dispute. Just paranoia, just a misunderstanding. But they filed the report, and that was what mattered. When he got home, he saw Karen standing in her front yard, watering her flowers, as if she hadn't spent the past few weeks systematically trying to make him feel unsafe in his own home. As if she hadn't orchestrated the city inspections, hadn't walked onto his porch in the dead of night, hadn't left rotting meat behind his shed. She looked up and met his gaze. Then, ever so slightly, she smiled. Something inside him snapped. Neil wasn't afraid of her. He wasn't going to be bullied out of his own home, wasn't going to let her manipulate the narrative until he was the one painted as the villain. He was done playing defense. So for the first time, he took a step forward instead of retreating. He walked straight across the street, closing the distance between them before she had a chance to react. She straightened slightly, clearly surprised, but quickly recovered, putting on that same mask of polite amusement. "Well, good morning, Neil," she said, her tone sweet but edged with something sharper. Neil didn't waste time. "I filed a report with the police this morning." For the first time, he saw real surprise flicker across her face. Just for a split second, before she schooled her expression back into neutrality. "Oh, whatever for?" Neil didn't blink. "Someone left rotting meat behind my shed last night. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" Karen let out a light laugh, shaking her head as if the mere suggestion was ridiculous. "Oh, Neil, are you really going to start accusing me of something like that? That's a very serious claim." He took another step closer, his voice lower now. "It's not a claim. It's a fact. And if anything else happens, anything at all, you can bet they're going to be looking at you first." Her eyes darkened just slightly, just enough for him to see the truth beneath the surface. Then, just like that, she smiled again. "Well," she said lightly, brushing imaginary dust from her sleeve, "I do hope this little misunderstanding doesn't get in the way of our neighbor relationship." Neil didn't respond. He turned and walked back to his house, feeling the weight of her stare on his back the entire way. She knew now that he wasn't going to roll over. And that meant the real battle was just beginning. Neil had expected retaliation. He wasn't naive enough to think that walking up to Karen, looking her in the eye, and letting her know that he wasn't afraid would end things. If anything, it was an invitation for her to push harder, to try new methods, to prove to herself that she still had the upper hand. The way she had smiled at him before he walked away, the way her fingers had twitched just slightly like she was resisting the urge to lash out in that very moment, it was all the confirmation he needed. She had been waiting for him to react, for him to step into the game fully, and now that he had, she was going to make him regret it. It started small, just enough to unsettle him without giving him something solid to use against her. His trash bins, which he always left neatly at the curb on pickup day, were suddenly knocked over every single morning before the garbage truck arrived, their contents scattered across his driveway. He tried securing the lids, weighing them down with bricks, but somehow every time he woke up, they were overturned again. A stray cat? The wind? Maybe? But the way the mess was always spread with care, the way certain things, old mail, receipts, anything with his name on it, were left in the most visible places, told him otherwise. Then there were the packages. Deliveries he never ordered started showing up at his door, boxes of diet supplements, skin creams, ridiculous home exercise equipment. At first he thought it was a mistake, that maybe someone in the neighborhood had misentered their address. But when he checked the labels, every single one of them was addressed to him, purchased under his name. The realization settled like ice in his stomach. Someone Karen had been using his information to place orders, likely just to inconvenience him, to create frustration, maybe even to make it look like he was involved in something shady if he ever tried to dispute the charges. Neil kept a level head. He documented everything. He took pictures of the scattered trash, of the stacks of mystery packages, of the deliveries piling up on his porch. He called his bank, checked his accounts. Nothing had been charged to his card, which meant whoever was doing this wasn't trying to steal from him. They were just trying to make him look crazy. He had heard about tactics like this before, the slow manipulation of reality, the way small, calculated disruptions could wear a person down, make them doubt themselves, but make them seem unstable to the outside world. He knew exactly what this was: gaslighting. Then the letters started arriving. At first it was just junk mail, an unusual amount of it, like his name had been signed up for every newsletter and magazine subscription imaginable. But then came the envelopes without return addresses, thick packets of paperwork that looked official at first glance. One of them was a notice from a debt collection agency, claiming he owed thousands of dollars on a loan he had never taken out. Another was an anonymous letter warning him that his property was being investigated for zoning violations. And then the worst one, a printed police report, completely fabricated, stating that he had been involved in an incident of domestic disturbance at his address. It wasn't real. He knew that. But if someone else had received this, If a neighbor had seen it, it was designed to plant doubt, to make people wonder, to make them start whispering about him behind closed doors. Neil took every letter straight to his lawyer. He had been documenting everything, but now it was time to take real action. His lawyer advised him to file a formal complaint with the authorities regarding identity fraud and harassment, but Neil hesitated. He knew that without definitive proof of who was behind it, all they could do was take his statement, put it on record, and tell him to keep an eye out. It wouldn't stop anything. Then, one night, the power went out. Not in the whole neighborhood, just his house. It was past midnight when he noticed it, the sudden, unnatural silence that came when everything electronic shut down at once. The hum of the fridge, the distant glow of the security cameras, the streetlights filtering in through the window gone. Neil sat up in bed, instincts immediately alert. He reached for his phone, but even as he did, he already knew this wasn't an accident. Pulling on his jacket, he grabbed a flashlight and made his way to the breaker panel outside. The air was cold, the neighborhood quiet except for the distant sound of crickets. But as he approached the side of his house, his footsteps slowed. The panel was open. The switches had been flipped manually. Someone had been here. A slow, steady burn of anger settled in his chest. He wasn't afraid. He refused to be. But this was a violation. Neil didn't call the police. He didn't want to give Karen the satisfaction of seeing flashing lights outside his house, of knowing she had rattled him enough to reach for help. Instead, he simply flipped the breakers back on, secured the panel with a heavy-duty lock, and walked the perimeter of his property with a flashlight. He checked every window, every door. Nothing was out of place. But someone had been here. Someone had been close enough to touch his house, to cut his power, to see what he would do. The next day, he installed additional motion sensors and bought a reinforced deadbolt for the breaker panel. He wasn't playing anymore. But Karen wasn't done. A week later, there was a knock at the door. A different kind of knock. Heavy. Official. When he opened it, 2 police officers stood on his porch. "Mr. Carver?" He nodded, already bracing himself. "We received a call from a concerned neighbor regarding a potential disturbance on your property." Neil didn't even have to ask who had made the call. His jaw tightened, but he kept his expression calm. "There's no disturbance here, officers." One of them, a younger man with sharp eyes, glanced past him toward the interior of the house. "Mind if we step inside for a moment? Just to verify everything is in order." There it was. The setup. Karen wanted him to refuse, to make it look like he was hiding something. But Neil had nothing to hide. "Of course," he said smoothly, stepping aside. The officers walked in, scanning the room, taking in the neatly organized space, the absence of any sign of struggle or wrongdoing. They walked through the kitchen, the hallway, even glanced out the back door before finally nodding. "Apologies for the inconvenience," the older officer said, clearly aware they had just wasted their time. "No problem," Neil said. "But if you don't mind me asking, what exactly was the nature of this complaint?" The younger officer hesitated. The caller reported, screaming. Neil let out a short, humorless laugh. "I live alone." The officers exchanged glances. They knew. Maybe they couldn't say it, but they knew. After they left, Neil stood at the window and looked across the street. Karen was on her porch, watching. She gave him a small, satisfied smile. Neil didn't smile back. He didn't react. He just stared at her, unblinking, unshaken, unmoved. And then, slowly, her smile faded. Because for the first time, she realized something. Neil wasn't going to break. And that meant she was running out of moves. Neil had spent weeks preparing for this moment. He had known, with absolute certainty, that Karen wouldn't stop until she had either forced him out or destroyed his reputation beyond repair. She had tried intimidation, manipulation, and even weaponized the system against him with false complaints and fraudulent reports. But nothing had worked. Every move she made, he countered. Every attempt to rattle him, he met with cold, unwavering resolve. And that was why, as he sat at his kitchen table late that night, staring at the silent darkness outside, he knew exactly what was coming next. The air inside the house was heavy, thick, with the kind of tension that only came when something inevitable was about to unfold. He had reinforced everything: locks, windows, security lights, cameras, but he also understood that none of that would matter when Karen finally decided to escalate. Because she wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully. She wasn't the type to let go, and the fact that he had denied her control for this long meant she would come at him harder than ever before. At exactly 2:43 a.m., the motion sensors in the backyard triggered. The floodlights blazed to life, casting long shadows against the trees. Neil, already awake, already waiting, moved silently toward the nearest window. He didn't panic. He didn't fumble. He had been expecting this. Outside, near the back fence, a figure stood frozen in the sudden light. It wasn't Karen. It was a man. Dressed in dark clothing, hunched slightly like he hadn't expected to be seen so easily, he hesitated for a moment before turning to flee. Neil moved fast. He grabbed his phone, snapped a quick photo through the glass, and then sprinted to the back door, yanking it open just in time to hear the sound of footsteps disappearing into the night. He didn't chase. He didn't have to. He had the photo. And more importantly, he had proof that this wasn't just Karen acting alone anymore. By morning, he was at the police station. This time, there was no indifference, no polite dismissal of his concerns. He showed them everything: the harassment, the fraudulent reports, the manipulated deliveries, the cut power, and now, the attempted break-in by an unidentified man in the middle of the night. The officer taking his statement looked grim, nodding slowly as he scrolled through the photos Neil had taken. "We're going to take this seriously," the officer finally said. "And if this connects back to the neighbor you mentioned, we're going to make sure she understands the consequences." That should have been enough. It should have ended there. But Karen wasn't done. That evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, Neil heard the sound of tires crunching against gravel. He looked out the window to see Karen standing at the edge of his driveway. She wasn't alone. Two men stood beside her, both unfamiliar, both exuding the kind of quiet aggression that didn't need to be spoken aloud. They weren't here to intimidate him with words. They were here to make a statement. Neil stepped outside, keeping his stance neutral, his expression unreadable. "Something you need, Karen?" he asked, his voice calm. She smiled, but it was all wrong. Too wide, too forced. "I just wanted to have a little chat before things get unpleasant." Neil's fingers twitched slightly at his sides, but he didn't react beyond that. He wasn't stupid. He knew exactly what this was. A final warning. An attempt to scare him into backing down, into leaving. "I already filed a report with the police," he said evenly. "They're taking this very seriously now. You might want to reconsider whatever you're about to do next." Karen tilted her head slightly, pretending to think about it. "Oh, Neil," she said softly, "you really don't understand how things work around here, do you?" One of the men shifted his stance, just slightly, just enough to make his presence feel heavier. Neil didn't move. He didn't even blink. "I understand that if you don't leave my property in the next 5 seconds, you're going to regret it," he said, his voice steady. Karen's smile faltered, just for a second. But he saw it. He saw the flicker of doubt, the moment where she realized he wasn't afraid. Then, slowly, she exhaled and took a step back. "You're making a mistake," she murmured. Neil didn't say anything. He just watched as she turned and walked away, the two men following close behind. He didn't move until they were gone, until the sound of their car disappeared into the distance. Then, and only then, did he allow himself to breathe. The next morning, Neil woke up to the sound of police sirens. Not outside his house, outside Karen's. He stepped onto his porch just in time to see officers escorting her to a waiting squad car. She wasn't screaming. She wasn't fighting. She was silent, her face set in cold, unreadable anger. One of the officers approached him. "Turns out that break-in attempt last night wasn't random," he said. We got a hit on the guy's description from your photo. He's connected to some questionable people. Neil didn't ask what that meant. He didn't need to. She's being taken in for questioning, the officer continued. And based on everything you've given us? She's looking at some real legal trouble. Neil watched as Karen was placed in the squad car. For the first time since this all started, he saw it. Not anger, not satisfaction, fear. She had lost. And this time there was no coming back from it. For the first time since he had moved in, Neil felt something close to relief. Karen was gone. The sight of her being led away in handcuffs, silent and stiff-backed as the officers guided her into the squad car, had been surreal. For weeks she had been a constant, suffocating presence, orchestrating chaos with an unnerving patience, always pushing, always testing. And now she was out of the picture. There was no final outburst, no desperate last stand, just the cold realization in her eyes that she had lost. The police followed up with him later that evening. The man who had been prowling near his house the night before had a history, a record of harassment and intimidation connected to similar disputes in other neighborhoods. They hadn't been able to link him directly to Karen at first, but once they dug into her financials, they found several cash withdrawals, all within days of the incidents at Neil's house. She had hired him. Maybe not directly, maybe she had gone through a middleman, someone else in whatever twisted network she was connected to, but it was enough. With the harassment reports, the fraudulent paperwork, and now a direct connection to a known criminal, Karen wasn't getting out of this easily. Best case, she's looking at multiple charges, the officer explained. Worst case, she's going to prison. Neil had nodded, processing the information, but he had already made peace with it. It wasn't about revenge or even justice. It was about getting his life back. And now, finally, he had. The neighborhood was eerily quiet the next few days. Word spread fast, and though no one spoke to him directly about what had happened, he could feel the shift in the air. People were avoiding eye contact, pretending they hadn't noticed the police cars, pretending they hadn't heard Karen's name whispered with something close to fear. Some of them, he suspected, had known. Maybe not the full extent of what she had done, but enough to realize that Karen had never just been a well-meaning neighbor. She had ruled this street for years, keeping people in line through pressure and manipulation, through intimidation disguised as concern. Without her, everything felt different. One morning, as Neil was sweeping his front porch, an older woman from down the street hesitated near his driveway. He had seen her before, though they had never spoken. She was holding a small plate wrapped in foil, shifting uncomfortably as if debating whether to approach. Finally, she cleared her throat. I heard about everything, she said, not quite meeting his eyes. Just wanted to say I hope you're okay. Neil paused, leaning on the broom. He wasn't sure what he had expected from the neighbor's hostility, maybe, or outright avoidance. He had anticipated this. I'm fine, he said after a moment. Thanks. She nodded, glancing back toward her house, then back at him. I never liked her, you know, Karen. Everyone always acted like she was in charge of everything, but she wasn't. She just made people feel like she was. She exhaled, rubbing her arm. I should have said something sooner. Neil didn't respond right away. He didn't blame her. He didn't blame any of them. He had seen firsthand how Karen operated, how she wormed her way into people's heads, making them believe she had control over things she had no real authority over. It was easier to let her have power than to fight back, until someone refused to play along. You don't have to explain, he said finally. She gave him a small, uncertain smile before holding out the plate. I made some bread. Neil hesitated, just for a second, before accepting it. Life went on. Karen's house sat empty for a while, the blinds drawn, the lawn growing untamed. A for sale sign appeared within weeks, and though Neil never saw who came to clean out the place, he knew Karen wouldn't be coming back. She was gone for good. The tension in the neighborhood slowly dissipated. People started talking more, stepping out onto their porches in the evenings, engaging in small conversations that had once seemed impossible under Karen's silent surveillance. It wasn't an instant transformation, but it was noticeable. As for Neil, he kept working on his house, kept restoring the details that had drawn him to it in the first place. The security lights remained. The reinforced locks stayed in place not out of paranoia, but out of preparation. He had learned his lesson. He wasn't the same person who had moved in months ago, thinking he could just exist in peace without interference. People like Karen always existed. He had just been unlucky enough to cross paths with one who had taken things further than most. One afternoon, as he was finishing a refinishing job on the front door, his phone buzzed. It was a notification from the local news. Former community organizer sentenced to 3 years in prison for conspiracy to harass and intimidate homeowners. Neil read the headline twice, then exhaled slowly. It was over. Really, truly over. There were no loose ends, no lingering threats, no reason to keep looking over his shoulder. He set down his phone, ran a hand over the newly polished wood, and stepped back to admire his work. The house finally felt like his,